Hello again, and welcome back to another video, and today we are looking at a scenario where World War I ended in a stalemate. There are a multitude of ways in which this will happen. I will just be showing one of them, but it could have also happened in some other ways, such as Germany accepts a peace treaty right before they collapse. They would still have to give up Alsace-Lorraine, possibly some, maybe slightly fewer lands to Poland, something like that. It most likely still some lands to Denmark as well. That's one way it could have ended. Perhaps they fall into some sort of revolution and that just changes the war. Or perhaps they manage to capitulate other powers quicker, or Russia survives longer. Maybe the UK doesn't join into the war. There are many different ways. I'm just going to be showing one of them, and let's go ahead and begin. First of all, Austria-Hungary is going to start their invasion down into Serbia. We're starting this a few weeks in, so we have these starting nations in the war. Austria-Hungary is simply going to set up defenses along the Danube River in northern Serbia. Meanwhile, they will begin a few small offensives along the Montenegrin coastline, hoping to cut off any Entente aid for Serbia or Montenegro. This may not work perfectly, as Greece may allow some supplies to get in, or Albania, but it would slightly weaken the Serbs, and, well, they believe that it will help them. I'm not trying to make the Central Powers win, but we do need them to do slightly better if we want this scenario to work out. The Germans would also begin a few smaller invasions along the French border. They would not quite yet declare war on Belgium, though. That is one of the largest parts of this. They would wait a few days, and now many people, even I think slightly, that a starting push into Russia could have very much so contributed to the war. A swift capture of Warsaw could have very much so weakened Russia and their morale. If they were able to set up a Polish puppet state sooner, they may have been able to integrate it better so that they wouldn't need as many troops into there. But do I think they should just avoid the French front entirely, crush the Russians, and then go back to France? No. In my opinion, that is not the smartest idea, as doing that would allow the French plenty of time to prepare. Now, this isn't very much later, this is about a month later. We're assuming the Germans are slightly better prepared as well. They will begin their first invasion of Luxembourg. At this point, the UK issues a warning against declaring war on Belgium. Germany attempts to avoid it, but in the end, invading Belgium does seem to be the best option, and they swiftly begin an advance into eastern Belgium. With this invasion, slightly later, but the UK will still join into the war, as at this point they've already wanted to for a while, and they are able to justify it to an extent. I'm not going to color in all Canada, as that would take a while, but all British colonies are now in the war as well. Oh, that is not what I meant to do. And now this war just got a whole lot worse for Germany. The Allies would immediately begin multiple offensives on the colonial front, managing to capture all of German Togo and much of German Cameroon, along with much of German East Africa and German Namibia. This, it's what they expected. When it comes to the colonial war, despite an absolutely massive German fleet, the German high seas fleet was very powerful. The British one was still the master of the sea, and if you add in the French Navy together with the British one, they could still outclass the Germans in just about every single way. The Germans would slow down on the Russian front, deciding that the French front was more important once more. But that doesn't mean they'd allow the Russians to gain any land. They are hoping to speed up Russian surrender. They would also swiftly push into northern France and do slightly better. In our timeline, they pushed immediately for Paris, and when that failed, they finally started to rush against the sea and did not even capture the entire Belgian coast. In this timeline, instead of doing that, they will stabilize in northern France and push towards the sea sooner, which would lead to staying further away from Paris, but they now control many more channel ports, and this would probably hurt France more in the long run anyways. Capturing all this land in northern France would not completely destroy the nation, but it would be absolutely devastating to them. The Germans would now also begin to aid Austria-Hungary in pushing into Montenegro, who would capitulate, and even into Serbia slightly. They would then get bogged down in France, where they now, after capturing the coast, begin a push towards Paris, which fails. They are pushed back, they push along the border, and they are now in what we know from our timeline, trench warfare, except in our timeline the border looked more like this. Germany is doing better, but this is still not a Germany capitulates France immediately scenario. And by now, the Germans would gain their first ally, maybe not the most competent of them, the sick man themselves, the Ottoman Empire. I don't know how great this would be for them, but we're going to assume the Ottoman Empire plays it a bit safer. They do not begin any offensives into the Sinai Peninsula, as in the end they would just get pushed back. Instead, they set up very strong defenses here in Israel, or at the time Palestine, and also attempt to hold the border against the Russians. They will not begin any offensives into Russia or Egypt, instead just distracting units and cutting off the Black Sea for the Russians. The Allies would probably attempt something similar to how they did in our timeline to capitulate the Turks, but the same as how it went in our timeline. This would fail, and a complete and total stalemate along the border would come out. The Russians, however, searching for victories, would begin their own invasion into the Ottoman Empire. It would work, but it would not be something major that truly impacts the war. At this point, the Entente would have already completely kicked the Central Powers out of Africa as well. But seeing as the war is going slightly better for the Central Powers and slightly worse for the Entente, I see the Bulgarians joining in sooner, and the Greeks joining in later. This would be important, as once Bulgaria joins, they can quickly capture Macedonia, and Serbia, who was already overstretched, would lose Belgrade, completely capitulating within a few months after Bulgaria joining. This would also limit Greece's ability to join, but the Russians, still trying to stabilize themselves through military victory, possibly not the best idea when your population is starving, but they begin a push into northern Austria-Hungary. Keep in mind, in this scenario, Austria-Hungary did not attack them and instead chose to fortify the border, which means although Russia does still see many victories, it is at a much higher cost. And with these Russian losses, and even though these are Russian victories, they would suffer far more casualties than the Austro-Hungarians. Romania, though, even if the Entente isn't doing as well, would still join the Entente eventually. They truly do want Transylvania. That's not perfect. They do still want Transylvania for themselves, and I think they would join the war even if the Entente is on the verge of losing. This would not go well for them. Bulgarian and Austro-Hungarian troops that were just freed out of Serbia go in and crush any Romanian effort immediately before they even have a chance to militarize. So now if you look at this world map, it's not going a whole lot better for the Central Powers, but it is going better. The Germans also toned down the amount of submarine raiding they do, which means the United States may join into the war later, if at all. The Germans now, though, after being bogged down in the Western Front for a year, decide to refocus onto the Russians. Their immediate push would go even better, as Russia is missing key cities in Poland, such as Warsaw, and Austria-Hungary manages to push the Russians nearly out of their country completely. The Germans would also send Lenin and, well, not support, but strengthen some communist influences in Russia, attempting to capitulate them sooner. This immediate push would cripple the nation, and communist insurgencies, even if small at first, would start to break out throughout. The Russians, who still held land in the Ottomans, would maybe limit the amount of, damage that the Armenian genocide does, which may mean a much higher Armenian population going into the future. This could lead to a larger country, and may actually hurt the Russians in the long run. This point as well, Bulgarian and Austro-Hungarian forces are pushing in from the south, as even tiny Bulgaria is managing to defeat the Russians in some aspects of the war. The Austro-Hungarians fully push out Russian troops, and a unified front is made, as Russia is starting to collapse. The communists at this point would take advantage of the situation and would declare that the communist revolution has finally begun, originally in St. Petersburg and a few other smaller territories around Russia. But they would swiftly consolidate, especially in the north, where they managed to create this nice big purple dot. I would make it red, but that would just not work in this scenario. And they also meet together with Ukrainian communist fighters and form up a powerful southern front as well. Germany has captured less land, but I think they could very well start looking for peace with the Russians. Russia, although having lost less land, is probably in a worse state. And I see them signing peace with Germany very soon being a very real possibility before the communists even take control. I'm going to assume that that is what's going to happen, and the peace treaty would still absolutely destroy Russia. They would be forced to let go of Poland and and Lithuania, along with another smaller German colony in the Baltics, or German puppet. Along with this, a Ukrainian state, even if smaller than all of Ukraine, would be made under German influence to support the Germans in their wars. A Belarusian state would also be created. This is significantly less land than in our timeline, but it is also a good amount sooner. And it'll be interesting to see how this affects the Russian war. The communists had been promising three things: peace, land, and bread. They can no longer give peace. And if the main Russian government manages to redistribute land before the end of the war, the Germans might grab up some smaller territories in Estonia, and Finland would most likely gain their independence at some point here as well. But the Russian government isn't doing too terribly in this scenario. The communists are still a threat, but they're being defeated significantly more successfully than in our timeline. With peace on the Eastern Front being achieved, they would now be able to focus far, far more on the Western Front. They still cannot break through. Fact is, the Germans could not break through probably ever, and at this point the Italians had already joined in as well. This wouldn't be a perfect scenario for the Germans, but they have ended the war sooner, they have less land to occupy, and they've captured more France. They would also, together with Austria-Hungary, begin a push into Italy, managing to capture Venice. The Allies, although maybe not the most excited for it, would probably soon start to look for peace. And it's a good thing they didn't do it quite yet. There's a chance that a peace treaty happens right here, right now, right after the Russian collapse and Russian exit from the war, where the Allies really look like they're going to lose. But even though it is later than in our timeline, good old America has now joined the war. USA joining the war would cause any kind of negotiations to end immediately, as it looks like this war will finally turn around. I didn't map it out, but at this point Japan had also joined into the war, and multiple colonies had also joined, along with the Arabs who had joined against the Ottomans. The Ottomans at this point would be struggling heavily, as the Allies have pushed into all of Iraq and Syria, and with insane Ottoman decline, I forgot to draw in what the Ottomans would gain from Russia, which is quite a lot, despite the fact that they didn't do a ton. They would gain an Azeri puppet, and they would expand themselves into any lands they could have possibly claimed, and possibly even more. Even with these new lands, it may actually make them more unstable as they control more Armenian populations, who would want to rise up in their numbers. The Allies would continue to push into the southern Ottomans, including all of Kurdistan, and soon enough, a new invasion around Istanbul would capture the key city, and the Ottoman Empire would collapse. Instead of Bulgaria, who collapsed first in our timeline, the Ottomans would just completely get destroyed. Although the Central Powers, who had by now redirected troops down south, would manage to recapture the key city of Istanbul and some surrounding territories, while the Allies are taking control of the rest. They would set up a new Ottoman state in the north, pretty much just a German puppet state. It would be fairly weak, though, and would not be able to hold alone. This is now just a new battlefront for the Germans to worry about. Looking at Russia, it's not very important for now, but the communists managed to take control of Ukraine, for now, and also all of northern Russia. The Russians, however, would manage to push back into Ukraine very, very soon, as practically the entire world is on their side, even though they cannot send much aid as they are in a war of their own. The Ukrainian threat is receding quickly, as multiple calls either to unite with the Germans, to unite with the Russians, to unite with the communists, it is incredibly divided, and actual communist funding from anybody in the world is completely gone. There is nobody who wants to help them, and even the people they rule are starting to rebel against them. Over in the west, France would begin some minor counterattacks. In the north, they would regain many lands, and along the border, they would also push back up to the Belgian one. This would harm the Germans, but most importantly, Venice would be recaptured, along with all of Italy, and Austria-Hungary would begin their own collapse, as Germany is starting to see that they cannot win this war. However, they are still in a decent position. They have not yet capitulated, and they actually still hold many, many territories, especially near the British Canal, and they are now going full submarine raider on the Allies. If they can manage to push back in Austria-Hungary and secure Austro-Hungarian independence, they may just be able to negotiate from this slight position of power to gain a reasonable peace treaty. And even though they are still occupying many territories, let's go ahead and see what this peace treaty would look like. Wouldn't be pretty, but in the end, France would not accept any peace treaty, especially now that it's clear that they are going to win any peace treaty that does not involve them gaining full control of Alsace-Lorraine. They still claim this territory in our timeline, and there's just no way they would leave the war without it. The Germans would also most likely lose some of Schleswig-Holstein to the Danes, maybe not as much, as Denmark didn't want it to begin with, but some slight border corrections would be made. Along with this, a greater Polish state would be set up. Once again, slightly smaller borders, not even reaching the sea, but it would still be expanded. Austria-Hungary would lose many lands to Italy, possibly, well, not as much as Italy would have liked. And Austria-Hungary. What do we do with the dying empire? Division? Most likely, yes. Austria, which at this point had become more of a German puppet than anything else, would start to consider joining Germany. It would most likely be a stipulation in the peace treaty that they could not directly join the Germans, but it may just happen in the future anyways. And despite Germany having conquered the Balkans, they would not keep it for very long. Serbia would be expanded, Romania would be expanded, Ukraine would be given independence and eventually start their own side on the Russian Civil War. Belarus and the Baltics would be given independence. Poland would be given independence, and Poland would actually be expanded massively down into Habsburg-controlled territories. Along with this, Ukraine would be expanded quite largely as well. These are territories with them as the primary speakers. I do not see them struggling to take control of these territories. And we now see a smaller, but still okayly sized Poland. They control their most core regions and most Polish-speaking territories, although they did not gain any access to the ocean, which would hurt them heavily in the long run. Ukraine, I think they would join in on their own side to gain independence and regain many of their lands from the Russian Empire and the Soviets who were trying to rebel. In the Baltics, the Russians would most likely reinvade and recapture it, possibly even in Belarus as well, as it is split between Poland and Russia. Ukraine has a fairly higher chance of surviving in this timeline, and Germany is also a decent amount larger. Africa would get split up very similarly to our timeline. Bulgaria may even lose some lands. I did not talk about this because I completely forgot, but at this point Greece would have joined into the war on the side of the Entente. And the Ottomans, the only ones to have truly collapsed in this war. The Germans, they lost some territories. The Austro-Hungarians did lose some territories. It is very possible that Hungary declares their own full independence very soon. but they are still technically alive, although very soon to be divided. Germany lost some lands to Poland and some lands to France, which are fairly justifiable. Honestly, I don't see them keeping Alsace-Lorraine after war unless they had a complete and total victory. But the Ottomans completely collapsed. They did not stand much of a chance. I am going to assume that the Arabs are expanded more simply because I like scenarios with a larger Arab world. This United Arab State, if you ask me, had so much potential, and the European states just destroyed it immediately. And although I do consider unlikely that they would be given this large of a state, I'm going to make it happen anyways, because why not? Simply for that reason. Of course, Palestine would go to the United Kingdom and Syria would go to France. That just simply cannot change very easily. As for the rest of the Turks and what is going to happen to them, Italy is going to get the south, Greece is going to get the west, and some sort of international zone would be created around Istanbul. Along with this, an independent Armenian state would be created in the east, along with this Armenian state expanding into the Azeri state that had previously been created. Possibly a small Kurdish state would be created, but this would be in British in all but name. It's a British mandate. The only reason it's not a direct colony is because it is not directly connected to the British Empire. I'm going to quickly talk about the future of this. Germany still did lose a lot from this. They are connected to East Prussia, and they've not lost Memel, but they have still lost Alsace-Lorraine, and they would have some war debts to pay. They would most likely go similar to an our timeline. The best case scenario is actually if Wilhelm III takes over, not the second, as he would be absolutely shamed. And as for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they will die. The Hungarians would most likely want their independence very soon after, and as for the rest of Austria, it would most likely just join Germany, which may actually lead to a resurgence in German dominance if they control both Austria and Germany. I doubt this would be allowed to happen, but if it did, it would form a very powerful state in Central Europe. As for the end of Russia, I see a smaller but still under a weak government, no Soviets in coming out as the victors in Russia, as they would most likely lose even more lands to Ukraine, to Belarus. I still think they would manage to recapture the Baltics, but they have still lost many more territories than they did in our timeline, and they are under a much weaker government as Nicholas, what's that his name? Yeah. As the Tsar of Russia is gonna lose most of his power. Even if he won the Civil War, he would still lose most of his power to some sort of assembly, some sort of government that would take over. This government would be weak, and with the Ottomans gone, Russia would be the new sick man of Europe. I'm gonna end it there, but I do hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.